So charges are going to be dropped against a trucker who drove into Minneapolis protesters after George Floyd's murder. And so this is yet but another disappointing situation. So I'm going to read that again. So charges to be dropped against trucker who drove into Minneapolis protest after George Floyd murder. And so this is by David K. Lee. I believe it's Lie. So correct me if I'm wrong on that naming. So charges against a trucker who drove into Minneapolis protester in wake of the George Floyd murder will be dropped entirely if he stays out of trouble for a whole year. So he has a stipulation, um, something that he has to follow. He has to stay out of trouble for the whole year, and then that charge can be totally dropped, or him being granted, you know, an exemption. Or so I talked about this in a previous video, that they were going to be looking at these cases that we've seen in the past, or more recently, um, or the more recent, how would you say it, the more recent events that had occurred from past, where you would see people protesting, and then you would see someone with a car or with a truck, and they were driving into protesters. So what I have been hearing is that a lot of these people may be able to be granted immunity, or what you see here in this article. And so this is another disappointing situation, especially for people who are trying to express their right to free speech, or their right to um, speak out on social awareness and in their community of some of the or if not just some, but the many problems of uh, uh, racial profiling, police brutality, some of the wrongdoings that normally happen in communities where people reside. So these charges against this trucker who drove into the Minneapolis protester in wake of the George Floyd murder will be dropped if he stays out of trouble for a whole year, in an arraignment made public on Friday. So during a virtual hearing before District Judge William Koch, a defendant Bogdan Vechirko, he's 36 years of age, agreed to abide by all of the laws, and in 1 year charges of this, which it would have been a felony because of threats of violence and gross misdemeanor and criminal vernacular operation, they say it'll be wiped clean from his record as if he never even attempted it. And so protesters hand over police the driver of the tank truck after he drove into hundreds of protesters. So here he is pictured here, and the protesters who basically handed him over to the police. So they're giving this guy a second chance. He just has to stay out of trouble for a whole year. And so this is him in the middle of what had occurred when he attempted to run over a group of protesters right after the George Floyd murder incident. And so the truck driver said that he did not know there was a protest. Now, this was coming from him on the interstate of 35 West over the Mississippi River, as thousands gathered in wake of Floyd's murder, slaying 6 days earlier by then Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, who was later convicted of murdering Floyd. Nobody was seriously hurt, though. A criminal complaint said at least one protester suffered abrasions after jumping out of the way of this truck. And so Reshirko said that the on-ramp he entered was not blocked off. So a spokeswoman for the Hennepin County attorney could not be reached for the comment on Friday afternoon. So Versherko's attorney, Kevin DeVore, said the arraignment is what's right for his client and the community as well. So we are prepared to dig in and fight it, DeVore told the NBC News on Friday, but they had to prove my guy had the right sight lines to see the crowd in time, and it would come down to the testimony and trial about reaction times. So I think it was a combination of looking at the evidence and also what's right for him and what's right for the community. So this is a very short article, so this pretty much outlines how they're going to approach these type of cases, because there were other little things that were happening. Well, they weren't little, but they were things that were happening during these protests. There were protesters that were attacked by police. They are suing their people that ended up in the hospital. Some, I heard, lost eyesight. There were protesters that I heard through projectiles at police officers. Some police officers had said that they were injured and that they were also, I believe, they were going through their legal process of what they had to do to go about getting their situation resolved. Then you had these cases where there were cars or trucks or certain people that saw protesters and they went, instead of turning around and going another way, they went ahead and tried to barrel through the protesters. And it looked as though an act of maybe hate or frustration, um, that the people were even out there. And so I heard more acts of hate. Then you had situations where people were saying that they were thrown into cars and they were let off somewhere by unmarked cars. I know that was happening. I believe that was happening in one state where protesters were being snatched away from certain events, protest events, and they were thrown in cars and taken to who knows where. And so a lot of things have happened with these protests. There's been people that have come to the protests, counter protesters who have gotten in fights with other counter protesters. Then there's been shootings or people coming to the protest with guns, people pointing guns at protesters, which we heard recently. A couple, they just uh, basically they surrendered their firearms that they used during the time. They're allowed to keep firearms in their home and have their firearms to their personal use, but they cannot have the very firearms, I believe, that they used during the time that they pointed the McCloskey couple. They actually have been very vocal lately. They've been on news media, I believe Fox, CNN. They've also, what I've been hearing is Mr. McCloskey is looking at running for a political seat. And so all of these things have been happening out of these protests and the incidences from George Floyd. And now I think my previous video was talking about the bills that are being passed through, um, um, that they're trying to get passed by the Senate to basically support law enforcement, so that they can actually crack down on protesters. So this is a big deal here. I know it may not seem like such, but it is, because they're really getting themselves ready for what may occur for this new virus that is floating around called the Delta virus. And what I'm hearing is right away there won't be lockdowns, but it could come down the pike at some point. There might be interval lockdowns, or there could be certain places of business that, if it's heavily trafficked, that could be limited access. But they're saying that they won't totally lock down everything. Now, right now, the United Kingdom are in Britain, London, they are protesting right now because their lockdown didn't lift. It has been extended because the virus is there and it is really active. And that is the reason why I'm hearing that they may go as to their lockdowns all the way to Christmas until like December sometime. So that is not sitting well with that general population and the people that live there, and they're protesting right now that they want to be taken out of lockdown. They've been locked down for a long length of time, and their lockdown has been extended. And so this is not getting any better as it may seem. Also, mind you, theme parks are opening up in California. A lot of places, restaurants, you can do indoor dining. I believe some places have it where you can do indoor and outdoor dining because they're trying to cover themselves so they don't have to be impacted by any more closures. Um, we took a lot of loss from the lockdowns that happened in 2020 and the earlier part of 2021. So we're trying to rebound as we speak. And so this is where we're headed. So now they're focusing on all these protests and the protesters and those that may come thereafter. And so be aware of this, that freedom of speech is threatened. The freedom of speech and the democracy of this country is being threatened by all of these bills, all these things that are happening where they're granting immunity to people who are basically trying to run over protesters that are speaking out on using their platform of freedom of speech. They're trying to stifle the speech of Americans that are hurt most greatly by some of these situations that we've seen with police brutality, racial profiling, and all of the other and above issues that have to do with the systemic structure of racism and of hate. And we have a lot of hate crimes that are spiking, and it just seems like it's not in just pockets or isolated incidents. It's everywhere that you could think of. Um, the crime, I believe, will go back up, but it has gone back up, and but homelessness is what is growing because of the evictions, the mass evictions. And so they are gearing up. When you see all of this happening, be aware that they are protecting themselves. They're lawyering up, is what they call it. They are trying to pass bills in record speed. They have collectively gotten together to try to basically deter people from the right to freedom of speech. So having said that, I'm going to let this video go. Thank you. Like, comment, subscribe, and thank you for listening.